Well, hello there, everybody, and welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio Channel 109. I'm Jesse Weber, and I will be guiding you right now through the next phase of our program. And so let's talk about where we're at right now. Okay, we are in Verdict Watch. We are continuing to be in Verdict Watch in the case that really I like to describe as the Breaking Bad case. It is the case of the Reverend, or the Rev, Shaun Harrison out of Massachusetts. This is that Reverend who was, on one hand, a popular Boston street pastor, a dean at the English high school, an anti-gun activist. That was him on one end. But really, on the other end, the prosecution is saying he was leading a double life as a drug dealer. Let me rephrase, a drug kingpin. He not only had guns and drugs in his apartment, but it's alleged that he enlisted the help of high school students to help him sell these drugs. One of those students was a man, or a young man I should say, named Luis Rodriguez, and this is where the story takes an interesting turn. According to Mr. Rodriguez and prosecutors, there was a dispute between Rodriguez and Harrison over decreased drug sales. So what did Harrison do? Well, it's alleged that he lured Mr. Rodriguez out one night and shot him in the back of the head execution style. Miraculously, Rodriguez survived this shooting and testified against Harrison in open court. So Harrison right now, the Rev, is on trial for gun charges, drug charges, and charges related to the attempted murder of this high school student. It is a bizarre case, but it is an interesting one to follow. So we are in Verdict Watch. As soon as we have an update in that courtroom, we'll make sure to jump in there. But that is not the only case that we're covering here on Law and Crime. There is jury selection right now in a really, really sad case about a woman who's on trial for shooting a mother and stealing her baby. I wish I was making this up, but I'm just not. We have a report about this case. Take a look. Thanks, Anthony. A really chilling case right there, and we are going to cover it here on Law and Crime. It's in jury selection, so it may start tomorrow, but as soon as we have an update, we'll let you know. But let's talk a little bit more about it because of the bizarre nature of it. So I want to bring on my very special guest, criminal defense attorney David Pietro. David, always good to see you.
Nice seeing you again.
Let's talk about this case. Really, I want to talk about the defense here. The defendant's not saying she didn't kidnap the baby, but she's saying, I had permission to kidnap the baby, and when I brought that gun in to take the baby by force, it just accidentally went off. Am I missing something here?
No, the story is bizarre, but it's what she's saying. What's damning for her case is her confession of putting herself at the scene of the crime. Sometimes that's a very hard thing for the prosecutor to do, because the person that usually is the one that's murdered can't testify that that's the person that murdered me. So by putting herself at the crime and putting the gun in her hand, all she's got is this accidental discharge argument. I hope she got a really good expert that this type of gun can accidentally discharge.
We covered cases here where they tried to do accidental discharge, had really strong experts say that the gun probably went off by accident, or it's a hair trigger, could have just gone off like that. Just a guess. Don't think it's going to be that successful, but who knows? I'm not one to judge. We'll have to see how that case ultimately resolves, and we will cover it here on Law and Crime. These are just the beginning details of the Yesenia Sesmas case. We'll cover it more.
What I think would be interesting for everybody to keep an eye on is whether the gun was a single action or a dual action firearm. Single action is a better argument that it could have discharged because the hammer would be back already.
That's a great point, David, and that was what we saw in the Tex MacGyver case, another case that we covered here on Law and Crime about an attorney who was on trial for the shooting death of his wife, said, look, we can't determine what mode it was, if it was in single action, double action, and really it was up to the jury to determine what mode was it ultimately in, and if it was possible for it to be in single action. I thought that raised reasonable doubt. Ultimately, it did not in the minds of the jury. They convicted him, but it was an interesting conversation to have about how that gun operates. People think you just pick up a gun and fire it. Not so simple. It has different modes, and it depends upon how much pressure you need to pull that trigger. Accident, versus intentional. That's really what we're working towards. Now, that is not the only bizarre case that we're covering here, because what we have right now are the top crime stories of the day. And this is brought to you by Anthony Velez, our very good reporter, on these really strange cases that you might not have heard of. Take a look. Thank you, Anthony, for those stories. You can go to lawandcrime.com to follow more of them. And that first one about the USC gynecologist just has the flavor of Larry Nassar all over again. Really a shame. We will cover more of those cases later on, but really our focus right now is the Shaun Harrison case. We talk about it, this Boston pastor who's in some pretty hot water. He's on trial for multiple charges, gun charges, drug possession charges, as well as charges in connection with the attempted murder of a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. Let's bring back in David Pietro. So David, we're in verdict watch right now. We're waiting. As soon as I see something in the courtroom, I'm going to jump out of this. But we saw the closing arguments from both the prosecution and the defense, so I want to wrap up right now and try to understand where the defense is coming from. If I'm sitting in that jury and I don't believe the victim in this case, and I'm talking about Luis Rodriguez, the young boy who says that he was shot in the head by Shaun Harrison, if I don't believe him, if he wasn't credible on the stand because maybe his answers didn't seem to make sense, because why didn't he first pinpoint Harrison as the shooter immediately? If I take his testimony away, what evidence do I have, if I'm sitting on the jury, that Shaun Harrison was the shooter?
Not a whole lot, other than the other cohort's statements that he wanted them to attempt to kill the victim, and that's probably all they have. But that doesn't put him at the scene of the crime, and doesn't make him the shooter. So the credibility of the eyewitness victim is pretty critical.
The reason I ask that is because we're about to play the defense's closing argument, and I want our viewers and our listeners to really pay attention to this, because that's the point they make. Now, I won't be surprised if I see him guilty on possession of gun charges, or illegal possession of gun charges, or drug possession charges, because guns, ammunition, drugs, they were all found in his apartment. But these attempted murder kinds of, the flavor of this about the shooting, that's where I think the weaker part of the case is, and that's what the defense exploited in their closing argument. So let's play some of that for you right now. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. That was some of the defense's closing arguments in the Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts, or should I say the Reverend Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts. This street pastor, a popular street pastor who's on trial for a lot of different crimes, including drug charges, gun charges, and charges in connection with the shooting of a high school student named Luis Rodriguez, who miraculously survived and testified in open court against Harrison. Let's bring back in criminal defense attorney David Pietro. Now, you're a great criminal defense attorney. What did you think of some of these statements in the defense's closing argument?
Classic arguments from an experienced attorney on what the facts and the circumstances he's given on this case. So I thought it was a job well done. I don't know if it's going to seal the deal, but it's definitely he's working well with the evidence and facts that he had.
See, I think the biggest hurdle for the defense to say that my client is not a drug dealer are the text messages. We saw text messages in this case on Harrison's phone that clearly indicates he's dealing drugs. Would you agree?
Yes. Well, and that's the thing about you don't want to, as a lawyer, you don't want to lose credibility. So sometimes if you concede one thing, it shows that you're not a BSer, and which is if you don't and it's obvious, then the jury might be turned off by everything you're saying.
Well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I want to talk to David a little bit more about, again, if he might be guilty of drug charges and gun charges, but let's talk about that shooting. Is he the one who shot Luis Rodriguez? Because some of the facts don't make sense. Because the text messages, the conversations that he had with Luis Rodriguez before the shooting, maybe don't sound like someone who's about to kill someone. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. That was some of the defense's closing argument in the Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts, a popular Boston street pastor who's on trial for different charges. But really what the defense attorney was talking about right there were the charges related to the shooting of Luis Rodriguez. Shaun Harrison was a dean at the English high school. Luis Rodriguez was a student at that high school. It's alleged that Mr. Rodriguez was one of Mr. Harrison's drug dealers, and that they got into a dispute about decreased drug sales, so Harrison wanted him taken out, shot him in the back of the head execution style. But as the defense just said, where is there evidence that there was a dispute? Was there? Let's bring back in criminal defense attorney David Pietro. Do you think the defense made a good point there, that where is this evidence of fighting between the two? Because when Luis Rodriguez took the stand, he didn't say that there was any problems. In fact, he seemed pretty shocked that Harrison was the shooter, or as he claims, Harrison was the shooter.
No, I guess it depends on whether you believe the corroborating witnesses. But when there was an instruction to beat up the victim, and we have a video of that in high school. So assuming that the prosecution's witnesses are credible, the timeline and the events all sort of make sense in the end.
Oh, let's talk about that for a second, and I'm glad our viewers are looking at this. So all of our viewers, unfortunately, our listeners can't see this, but there is a video of the victim, Luis Rodriguez, walking down the high school hallway when, bam, he gets tackled right through a bathroom door by another student. That student who tackled him testified earlier in this case and said the reason he did that, he was directed by Shaun Harrison, the defendant, to do that. We can't deny the fact that this happened, but we can try to make sense of why did it happen. And this is the point that I have for you, David. Originally, this boy named Laudy, he said that it was because Rodriguez made a comment about his mother, and then he retracted and said, no, that's never the case. It was really because Harrison ordered me to do it. How's the jury supposed to reconcile these two different stories?
And that's the problem, right? It's the credibility of the witnesses, which, some of the prosecution's witnesses weren't like your rock stars. They weren't your pastors that got robbed after leaving church. These are, they're young guys, but they're still not like the Mother Teresa witnesses. So the prosecution better tie it up with other evidence to make their credibility worth the jury considering. Yeah,
but as we're talking about, what evidence is there that Harrison shot Rodriguez, or what evidence is there that there was a beef between them? You see at least maybe one piece of evidence right there about Luis Rodriguez getting tackled. Now, can Harrison be connected to that? Maybe, considering the fact that when that happened, he really didn't step in to break up the fight. Very questionable behavior from a man who is on trial for the attempted murder of that boy. It should be noted, I said earlier he faced 9 counts. Mr. Harrison actually faces 10 counts, but it should be noted that in the closing argument, the defense told the jury that Harrison was guilty of 3 of those counts, or should be found guilty of 3 of those counts. Again, the jury will ultimately have to determine his guilt or innocence in relation to 10 of those counts, but if the defense attorney is saying that he is guilty of 3 of those weapon possession charges, I'm pretty sure they'll probably come back with a guilty verdict on there. But really, the question is, the main crux of this case is the shooting of Luis Rodriguez. And what will the jury determine? We'll have to see. We've been playing you some of the defense's closing argument. Let's play you now some of the prosecution's closing argument, and you can hear how they summarize the case and tie it all together. Take a look. That was some of the prosecution's closing argument in the Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber. We're guiding you through right now this case as we are on verdict watch. We're waiting for the jury to come back with a verdict in this case. What will they find Mr. Harrison guilty of, if anything? He faces 10 different counts: gun charges, drug charges, and charges in connection with the attempted murder of Luis Rodriguez. It's claimed that he fired a gun in the back of Luis Rodriguez's head. But miraculously, this young man survived and testified against Harrison in open court. Let's bring back in David Pietro. So we're watching the prosecution's closing argument, and one thing still doesn't make a lot of sense to me. If he wanted to entrust these young men, if he was a dean at the high school and wanted to entrust these young men to sell drugs for him, maybe that's one thing. But why would a man who is planning to kill Luis Rodriguez tell other students that he was going to do it? That fact doesn't make sense to me.
You know, maybe he's a narcissistic person that just is so grandiose when he speaks, and this is who he is, and he's a bragger. You know, I think the closing argument was good because it showed that under the circumstances of, you know, having guns and drugs and children, that basically it was a way for the prosecutor to say he's just a bad guy. So that's clearly he's the one that did it, but he's intertwining a lot of other acts to just make him undesirable and get the jury to go the full distance.
But here's the question. So it's alleged, we had a lot of witnesses come forward, students at the English high school who said, I saw him sell drugs, he asked me to sell drugs, he asked me to attack Luis Rodriguez. Some of the witnesses said that the first thing that he ever did when he met them was show him pictures of his guns. Was that a threat in your mind? Was that saying to them, you better be quiet, if you believe this story?
Could be, yeah. I mean, it could be like a way of saying this is to keep you hush hush. Look what, you know, because I'm the kind of guy that has guns and I'm a mean guy and I'll take you out. So it might be a way of using, you know, mind control over, you know, kids. They're inferior, both in experience and mental ability, and that they would have more fear. So yeah, it's a good argument to be had.
Look, I always try to find the common sense in any case. So this could all be true, but from a common sense perspective, isn't it a little strange that you would have a guy who's in his 50s all of a sudden turn to not just a life of crime, but try to be a kingpin and be a drug dealer, try to be a murderer, you know, all these kinds of things? Isn't it a little strange that all of a sudden to do this 180? Because I haven't heard from his past about doing any kind of crimes like these. So that becomes the question. Is it really like Breaking Bad? He did a 180 and wanted to make a big change in his life?
Maybe. Yeah, it's hard to say. Who knows what his whole life story was. The jury usually doesn't get to hear about your entire criminal past. That's all precluded for obvious reasons, that it's so prejudicial. But maybe, I don't know, maybe...
I want to know. I want to know. I'm not sitting on the jury.
Maybe birds of a feather. I think his son did the same crime. He shot somebody in the head. So I don't know. Obviously, the jury won't hear that as well.
Yeah. It's an interesting one to follow. As soon as we have an update in the courtroom, we'll let our viewers and our listeners know. We'll take a quick break, and when we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about whether or not this shooting was actually captured on surveillance footage. And if so, was Harrison the shooter? We'll be right back. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody, and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio Channel 109. I'm Jesse Weber, and I want to thank all of our listeners and our viewers for joining us. We're very happy to be on both ways to getting to you. And really, what are we talking about today? We're talking about the Reverend Shaun Harrison case. So we're happy we can talk to you about this and tell you about it through all these different platforms. So, the Reverend Shaun Harrison, we keep talking about it, this popular Boston street pastor, this dean at the English high school, is on trial for basically leading a double life. That prosecutors say he was really a drug kingpin who tried to kill a high school student. I wish the facts, I'm not making them up. Sounds like straight from a movie, that he was leading this double life. What we're doing right now is we are on verdict watch. We're waiting for the jury to come back with a verdict on multiple charges in connection with these crimes. We're recapping the entire defense's closing as well as the prosecution's closing. This was the opportunity for both the defense and the prosecution to sum up their arguments and say, jury, this is why you should find the defendant guilty or not guilty. The last thing, really, that the jurors hear from both sides. So we were playing you a little bit of the prosecution's closing argument about why they believe Mr. Harrison was the shooter in this case. Remember, he's on trial for shooting Luis Rodriguez in the back of the head. Let's talk a little bit more about this video. So we talk about this video. There is a surveillance footage of what appears to be the shooting going down. Two figures walking in the dark, dressed in dark clothing, walking out in the snow, one with an outstretched hand. Looks like he shoots the other one right in the back of the head, and then the shooter runs away. Is that Shaun Harrison? Is it? Can you tell from that video? Maybe, maybe not. Let's hear what the prosecution had to say. Some pretty good points there by the prosecution in their closing argument in the Reverend Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts. So this reverend is on trial for drug charges, gun charges, and charges in connection with the shooting of Luis Rodriguez, a high school student at the same high school where the reverend, or the Rev, was one of the deans. Let's bring back in David Pietro, criminal defense attorney. I thought the prosecution was doing a good job in their closing argument there, and they really touched upon the surveillance footage. I talked about this before. This shooting, again, it's alleged that Harrison lured Mr. Rodriguez out one night and shot him in the back of the head execution style. It's actually captured on surveillance footage, or I should say what appears to be the shooting is captured on surveillance footage. What did you think of the prosecution's argument that if you look at that character and you look at the way he looks, you can tell it's Harrison? And I'm not sure if he said it there or in another part, but that the way he runs the gait, it looks like Shaun Harrison. It doesn't look like a young kid who's the shooter, but it looks like a middle-aged man. So
that might actually eliminate the other younger classmates from being a possible shooter, but that grainy video is about as bad as it comes. So it's not going to positively ID him, because there could be a lot of people with that kind of gait and that kind of stature as they walk and run in that community. So it might be good for eliminating some, and if there's no other possibles, great. But if there's still other possible opportunities, it could still, the door's still not quite closed.
What about his reaction afterwards? You heard it from the prosecutor that when he was told that Lewis got shot, Harrison grasped his chest and said, oh, almost like he was having a heart attack. Is that overacting? What do you think?
Maybe. I think it would be worse if he acted like he already knew. So I'd rather be over dramatic or melodramatic than non-dramatic, right?
Not to defend anybody here, but isn't it not fair? Isn't a common argument put forward by attorneys? How can you judge someone's reaction to tragedy? We've seen it in other cases before where spouses are said, you didn't cry enough, or you cried too much, or what's that line? What's that line between seeing what a genuine reaction is or not? Don't people respond to incidents in different ways? Or am I being a little too naive and saying somebody is covering something up?
You know, I agree with that. You really, if people are in shock and they deal with shock in different ways, the question is in their purported shock, if it's false and it's acting, is do they state things that the police never told them, so they already had knowledge of facts that were not disclosed. So if they say like he's all right, or they already know he's alive, or they whatever it might be, to indicate they already have knowledge of the incident before the police arrive in question.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to make sense of it because, again, you're not in the shoes of you, right? Ladies and gentlemen, you're not you responding to this. You have to say, what is the defendant? And if you take what the defendant is a reverend, he's living in Boston, you have to take all those circumstances and figure out how this person would react to it. But again, there's so much, you tell me if this, it's circumstantial evidence of the actual shooting, but if you look at the fact that drugs, guns were found in his apartment, you look at the text messages he sent, you look at his behavior, even look at the artwork that he had of the Latin Kings. I think he might have had a picture or a poster of that. Does that just say to you, this guy is really not the person he's portraying himself to be, and maybe that is circumstantial evidence of his guilt in the shooting?
Yeah, I think the prosecution did a pretty good job of showing that he's a slimeball. There's no question about that. I would gather that there was motions to sever these counts, because having these counts all try to intertwine like this really paints a bad picture of who this individual is. If they could have been severed or they weren't, then that might be an issue on appeal, because in intertwining it all together, people might just convict you if they think you're a bad person.
Yeah. Well, one of the key actors in this case, if I were to have trading cards for this case about the key figures, is Luis Rodriguez, the victim. We were lucky enough, and the world was lucky enough, that he didn't pass away from this shooting. But really, the jury was lucky because they had the opportunity to hear him testify. How often do you get that, the victim, to testify? Now, he said under direct examination, Harrison, he was the one who tried to kill me. The defense, under cross-examination, poked holes in his story. Let's play some of that right now. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. That was some of the testimony from the victim in the Reverend Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts, a popular street pastor, a reverend, who is on trial. He faces 10 different counts, including gun charges, drug charges, and charges in relation to the shooting of the victim, Luis Rodriguez. It's alleged that Mr. Harrison was actually operating a double life as a drug kingpin. Luis Rodriguez was one of his drug dealers. They got into a dispute, and he wanted him taken out, lured him out one night, shot him in the back of the head, execution style. Now, I have an update for you, ladies and gentlemen. As I said, we are in verdict watch. But guess what? The verdict is in, and it will be read in about 10 minutes. So we are going to be live in that courtroom as the verdict is read. Which way will the jury go? We don't have to speculate anymore. We'll take a quick break, and when we do, it's going to be very interesting to hear which way the jury goes, because maybe what they'll say is, hey, Shaun Harrison, maybe you're guilty of drug charges and gun charges, but not so much on the shooting. Or maybe they'll find him guilty across the board, or maybe they'll find him not guilty. Who knows? That becomes the question. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, Channel 109. I'm Jesse Weber, and we are covering the Reverend Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts, this popular street pastor who is on trial for many crimes, including attempted murder. That's right, he's on trial for allegedly shooting a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. Now, we were in verdict watch, but guess what? The jury has come back with a verdict. We are waiting to go live into that courtroom, and as soon as we do, we'll make sure to go to it. Which way will the jury go? Let's bring back in criminal defense attorney David Pietro. David, which way do you think the jury's going to go?
Said he was going to testify last week, right?
You were. I don't want to say anything, but I did ask you if he was going to testify, and he didn't testify. So,
well, yeah, batting 500 in baseball is always not bad, so I say guilty.
You think guilty? Now remember, I want to just let our viewers and our listeners know about what he's on, what he actually faces, the different counts. So he faces armed assault with intent to murder and aggravated assault and battery with a dangerous weapon. That's in relation to the shooting. Then he faces 2 counts of unlawful possession of a firearm, 2 counts of unlawful possession of ammunition, possession of a firearm in the commission of a felony, unlawful possession of a shotgun, and unlawful possession of a rifle. Those are all the gun possession charges. He also faces possession of a Class D substance with intent to distribute. That's the drug possession charge. Is it possible, and I keep talking about it, that they could find him guilty of the guns and the drugs, but not the shooting?
It's possible. I think though, if they do get the murder, that they'll get every other count with it, because it all kind of goes hand in hand. Now, the possession of the firearm crimes, they've already conceded, so he's going to get something. The question is, if he's found not guilty, does the judge sentence him for the murder indirectly by maxing him out on the other counts, which I've seen happen many times, where one count comes back and the main count doesn't, and the defendant gets maxed out, when normally if that charge was tried individually, you might receive probation or something.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways this could go, and we are going to be live in that courtroom. So everyone, stay tuned. As soon as we have the feed, we'll make sure to jump into it. As we try to predict what's on the jury's mind, what will they ultimately decide, one of the things, and I know that was on their mind, was the testimony of Luis Rodriguez, the victim himself. How often do we get the victim to testify? And he pointed in open court to Shaun Harrison and said, that man is the one who shot me. Although, for him, under cross-examination, by the defense, he had a little bit of trouble trying to say why he didn't say Harrison was the shooter in the first place. Let's play you some of his cross-examination as we wait for the live verdict. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, Channel 109. I'm Jesse Weber, and that was some of the victim's testimony in the Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts. Now, this reverend, this popular street pastor, is on trial for gun charges, drug charges, and the attempted murder of the victim right there. That person, that Mr. Rodriguez, said that Shaun Harrison shot him in the back of the head in 2015, but he miraculously survived and pointed the finger at him in open court. What we have for you right now, ladies and gentlemen, is a live feed in that courtroom. We were on verdict watch. The jury came back with a verdict, and we are waiting for them to come in, and we will hear it. Now, what we saw as we were playing that clip was we saw Mr. Harrison come into the courtroom, speak with his attorney. He actually flashed a smile. I didn't know he didn't have front teeth, so there's something. You learn something new every day. Anyway, let's bring back in David Pietro, criminal defense attorney. David, what is the conversation between a client and his attorney before the verdict? What is that moment there?
Oh, this is butterflies time, for everybody, and it's like the longest wait from the time the jury walks in, hands it over to the clerk or whatever the procedure is, the bailiff. Maybe the judge will read it. It just is like it's the 5 minutes. It feels like 50 minutes. So it's like you don't even remember what you're saying. It's that intense.
But here's the thing. Does he say, listen, if it's guilty across the board, no reaction? If you're found not guilty, no reaction? What do you advise your client?
Yeah, don't pull a Bill Cosby, right?
That's a good point. Don't pull a Bill Cosby. Well, don't pull a Bill Cosby in a lot of different ways, but you're talking about in the courtroom, yeah.
Yeah, don't tell anybody to F off, or the judge or whatever. So you never know. You might have a position for a retrial, a mistrial. And there's another.
Really? That could be grounds for it?
No, meaning if you have grounds, you don't want to insult the judge.
Right. I hear what you're saying. Yeah, absolutely. Now, okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have a lot going on right now because not only are we in verdict watch, we're waiting for the jury literally to come into the courtroom, but we have an update in another case that we're covering, and I'm keeping a very careful eye on the courtroom feed. This is the Yesenia Sesmas case. Guess what? A jury has been selected in that case. Sesmas is on trial for murdering a mother and stealing her baby. We do expect possibly openings later. So what we might have is the verdict in this case and then going straight to the openings in another case. We will keep you updated. I just want to confirm do we have audio in the courtroom? Should we go to a break? I don't know exactly what's happening just yet. We see the camera has panned up right now in the Shaun Harrison case. Do we have audio? I think not yet. Not yet. The judge is speaking to the jury. I want to stand by, wait before we jump. We're waiting for that. So again, he faces a lot of different charges. Okay, we do have the audio right now in the courtroom. So let's go live into the Shaun Harrison case. What will the verdict be? Let's go.
I want you to avoid it. I want you not to talk about the case, not even among yourselves when you return tomorrow morning before you come back and assemble here before me. I don't want you to talk about it electronically or otherwise. Whether or not you had any questions about the evidence of the case and are tempted to try to help yourself by investigating or researching it, please avoid that. Nothing like I've told you before about investigating or researching or looking towards anything, whether mistaken belief that it might help you as jurors. Please don't do that. I want to thank you again. I know that this case is a matter that is always very, very draining to jurors. So I'm going to ask you to continue to bring the same level of attention that you've shown so far, and return tomorrow so that we can continue those deliberations at 9 o'clock. Again, on behalf of the parties involved in the case and the defendant, and certainly myself, thank you very much for your time and for your effort.
All rise. Joe, step down and follow me, please.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, a little bit of a letdown right there. We thought that there was going to be a verdict in the Shaun Harrison case, but it looks like the jury is going to continue their deliberations into tomorrow. So we apologize. We thought we were going to get a verdict there. David, I know, disappointing. But guess what? Guess what? We have another case for you right now. As we talked about, it was the Yesenia Sesmas case. This woman, an illegal, who is actually on trial for murdering a mother and stealing her baby. I want to bring back in, as I have him on via Skype, David Pietro, a criminal defense attorney. What do you expect in the opening statements by both the prosecution and the defense in this case?
I mean, just from reading the news reports, this seems like a pretty strong case for the prosecution because the confession, it basically puts this particular person in the scene of the crime. This is the person that shot the gun. The question is whether it was accidental. And that's really, I think that's all the jury's got from a factual standpoint. So hopefully the defense is going to say, we got this great expert that's going to do X, Y, and Z, and they're going to show you that it was truly an accident, and she's, remorseful for what happened, and it's something like it's on those lines.
Let's take a step back, okay? She went into that apartment, this is what we know, with a gun to steal a baby or to take a baby, because she believes, and one of her arguments is, or what we've heard so far, is that, well, she had an arrangement with the mother to have the baby. But going into the apartment with a gun, you create that situation. You're the one who brings a gun into the mix. So how can this really ever be an accident? She would be found guilty probably of a lesser charge, am I guessing?
Maybe. I mean, you raise a very good point. I mean, you're walking into a residence with a firearm. You better have a good reason to. It seems like she has to testify because it's her whole defense is she's got to get around what she already said and she's got to fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
Because it's just the whole factual scenario. It's just not one that causes a jury to think that this is not a potential crime of some sort.
It's an uphill battle, definitely an uphill battle. As we wait for the live feed in that courtroom, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in a minute, and we have a lot more to talk about in the Sesmas case. We'll be right back.